Hello and welcome to Sweetwater. I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. Some of you may know me as the Rig Doctor from our YouTube channel, where we talk about pedalboards and pedalboard best practices. And today we're talking about how to choose the right power supply for you. So I have some of my favorite brands and makers of power supplies right here on the table, and we're going to be talking about the old school power supplies, the linear power supplies, just like the Voodoo Lab Pedal Power 2, something that has been an industry staple for many years. And we're going to talk about the evolution of power supplies and some of the new stuff that offers really high current and variable voltages across all their outputs with other supplies like the ones from MXR, Cioks, and One Spot. Let's start with the old school power supply, which is called a linear power supply. Now this uses either a toroidal or an R-core or a C-core type transformer inside of it, and then has individual isolated outputs. In this particular model, we have up to 8 isolated outputs, and Voodoo Lab was really the first major player in the game that really revolutionized what isolated power supplies look like. Now this has 8 isolated power supplies and ranges from around 100 milliamps per output, and then they have a couple higher current outputs at 250 milliamps, and you have some options to go between 9 and 12 volts, and then in the end you have 2 variable voltage outlets so that you can adjust it anywhere from 9 and I think down to 1 or 2 volts at its minimum if you want to simulate some of the sag of a battery. Now these are great if you have kind of old school analog pedals and maybe a few digital pedals that are within the current requirements of what the Pedal Power 2 offers. But now we have so many pedals that require different voltages other than 9 volts and a lot of current, some of them as much as 1 amp or 1000 milliamps, which have forced us to have to revolutionize power supplies, and a lot of our other manufacturers have done a great job at doing that. Now I've got a couple of different budget versions of these new style power supplies called switch mode power supplies. And some of my favorites are this one here, like the MXR ISO brick and the mini ISO brick. These are 2 great power supplies which are switch mode power supplies, and essentially it's a completely dissimilar technology to what the old school isolated analog supplies are. These are still fully isolated, but they're using a different type of technology to do it, which makes the supplies more efficient, and not only more efficient, but allows them to have different voltages, more current, and it generates less heat. They're lighter weight, and the coolest thing is you can use them anywhere in the world. So you don't need to have a separate power supply like in the old days. If you bought a Voodoo Lab Pedal Power 2, you would be required to have one for every single voltage. If you're a traveling musician, you're going to be in Europe, you're going to be in Japan, you would have to have a different voltage version of the Pedal Power 2 for each country. But with things like the ISO brick and the Cioks and the One Spot, you can plug them in anywhere in the world and they're automatically going to recalibrate that input voltage for you. They're going to work seamlessly as long as you have the appropriate IEC plug that would be, obviously part of whatever that country's power supply needs are going to be. Another big advantage of using switch mode power supplies, other than being able to use them anywhere in the world without any need to have different power supplies, is that you don't have any issues with the proximity with which you put your power supply to the pedals. In some of the old school power supplies, kind of the Voodoo Lab generation, if you were buying a unit that wasn't using a steel chassis, you did risk having some possible noise because of the transformer inside of it. It emits a certain electromagnetic field, and steel does shield against any sort of electromagnetic field. But as these got bigger, when they tried to accommodate the larger, more powerful pedals and started making other versions, and this isn't just Voodoo Labs, this is a generalization across a lot of different linear power supplies, that they ended up having a little bit more noise because they had to go to aluminum chassis in order to be able to dissipate heat more easily and be able to accommodate that extra power that was needed in order to power big pedals like Strymons and larger Line 6 pedals and things like that. So instead of going with that, and I should also mention that Voodoo Lab does offer a switch mode power supply, which you can get right here at Sweetwater. A lot of companies have opted to shift over to what we see over on this side. Now, one of my favorites that I really want to highlight today are the guys at Cioks. Cioks makes incredible power supplies, and it's a little bit different than a lot of the ones you see here. You can see on the Voodoo Lab, it's using a 2.1 millimeter barrel, as is with the MXR and the One Spot. And you can see here that these guys are actually using RCA jacks. And some people look at this and they get confused and they go, gosh, like, why would we be using these RCA jacks? Well, one thing that I'll say is that it is a a superior quality connection to the 2.1 millimeter barrel. That doesn't mean that 2.1 millimeter is bad. It's just that this has a much more secure connection, so there's much less likelihood of this coming out. So I really like that feature, even though it's non-standard. I think it's really excellent, and I love what they're doing here. The other thing I love about these, you have at least 330 milliamps per output at 18 volts and 660 when you're at 9 volts. So you can presumably power almost any pedal in your arsenal off of the Cioks power supplies, and you can also combine them. So every single one of the Cioks power supplies has a feed through that you can add one of the addendum supplies to either put on top of it or put to the side of it, and it's going to be able to power multiple supplies. Now, there's one other really cool feature that I love about the Cioks, is that it has a rating scale right over on the left side there, and it tells you with their LEDs how much of the total current you've used up, because it's reading off of the AC mains that come in and the available current that's in the primary supply as it's feeding out, and it tells you how much you've used of the total available current, so you always know where you are in relationship to the primary supply as you expand. And to my knowledge, this is the only power supply that offers that feature, so that you know how close to the edge you are if you're going to connect multiple power supplies to the Cioks using their expansion supplies with the Cioks 8 and the Cioks 4. So a really cool feature that I love about Cioks. But I want to talk to you about another one of my favorite switching supplies, and this is actually kind of a hybrid switching supply. This is made by One Spot. This is the True Tone CS12. If you watched our videos on YouTube with the Rig Doctor, you see that we use these all the time. Now, the reason why I call this a hybrid supply is almost all of it is switch mode, but you can see on the back that there's actually a small toggle switch that goes between the US voltage, the 115, 120 volts, and then you can flip it over for a European voltage at 230 volt. And that's because if you see on the front, there's actually an AC output all the way on the side. So that toggle is only controlling that one output, or that slider switch. It's just controlling that one output. But everything else in here is switch mode. So there is technically a toroidal transformer in this one, or a C core, or an R core, one of those varieties, but everything else in it is switch mode. So this is sort of like a semi-switch mode supply. But I still find this one to be very quiet and not having any issues, even though it has a section of it that is linear. But I should also mention that One Spot offers two other supplies in the CS6 and the CS7, which are fully switch mode and excellent supplies. And again, using these anywhere in position to your pedals are going to have the least amount of risk for noise, whereas you have to be more careful with the linear supplies of old because they're not able to completely shield out that electromagnetic field, which can be a problem. Now, if you are on a budget, there are a couple of great supplies too that are made by MXR. They have the ISO Brick and the ISO Brick Mini. These are slightly different than the other supplies that we talked about because you have to use a specialized adapter that they include with every single one of their power supplies. This is what brings in the AC from the wall, and then you have to plug this end, which is I believe a 2.1 or 2.5 millimeter barrel connector, into the power supply itself in order to generate the power, and then you have all of your isolation done through the unit itself. These do not have the same ability to expand into addendum or auxiliary power supplies. However, they do offer several different voltages, variable voltages, throughout the MXR ISO Brick with different currents, so you can presumably power almost anything you need off of this one. And then if you need it to go a little smaller, you got a little mini travel board, same supply is included. You can go into this one and you can have your small board with a little tiny isolated power supply. Now, when you're considering the power supply to get, and all the ones that we're talking about are great, it's also important to consider the voltage and current requirements that are going to be needed in order for you to power the pedals that you have. Now, most of your pedals will come with some literature that will give you what the voltage requirements are, as well as the current, and you want to make sure that that matches up to what your power supply is able to accommodate. Now, one thing to know, and I get this question quite a bit, if you have more current available in your supply than you do on the pedal, that's totally fine. So for example, if this supply puts out 660 milliamps of current, and my pedal only draws, for example, let's say less than 10, that's totally fine. As long as the pedal doesn't draw more than what the power supply puts out, there's not a problem. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on is when you're setting up your board, and you're thinking about what power supply to get, it's really important to consider how close your pedals are going to be in proximity to the power supply. A lot of the pedal boards that we're putting together, Pedal Train and Temple, which make excellent pedal boards, they have a cool feature which you can put the pedal power supply underneath the board. However, when you're using a linear power supply in the style of Voodoo Lab, you have to be careful about how close you get those pedals to the power supply because, as we talked about earlier, having an electromagnetic field going through your pedals, you do risk adding some noise. Whereas with using the switch mode style power supplies or the semi-switch mode power supplies as we talked about, you have much less risk of that. So you can literally mount one of these supplies underneath your pedal board. You can have any pedals that you want on top of it, and because you don't have that same issue with the magnetic field, you do not have to worry about how close pedals get. You can put something right on top of your Cioks supply or right on top of your True Tone or right on top of your ISO brick, and there's not going to be any noise consequence to doing that. So just one thing you want to be aware of as you're putting your rig together, you're considering what supply you want. If you are going to be setting pedals on top of the supply, it might be a good idea to consider using a switch mode supply, or if you are going to use a linear power supply, making sure that it at least has some type of shielding from the steel, because if you're using aluminum, it's not going to have any more electromagnetic shielding. It's only going to have electrostatic, and that's not going to help you in this particular situation. So that was choosing the pedal power supply that is right for you. We have a lot of great choices here. Just depending on what your needs are, you may be just fine with the old school analog style linear power supply, or you may have a lot of fancy stuff, high powered line 6 stuff, high powered Strymon stuff, and that's really going to put you more in the switching supply territory. But irrespective of what you need, we do have you covered. Our Sweetwater sales engineers here are absolutely incredible and will know all the information about how to appropriately power your pedals and match you with the right supply. So if you do have more questions, be sure to talk to them about that. And also, if you like what you saw today, please be sure to subscribe, to like, to leave us a comment. And by subscribing, you're going to stay up to date with all the latest stuff that Sweetwater is coming out with. So that's it from me. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka The Rig Doctor. See you later.